Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and happy Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Our webinar today on stalking and intimate partner violence is provided by the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. I'm the director there, and we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, part of the U.S. Department of Justice, to provide training and technical assistance to individuals who are working on the crime of stalking all across the country. If you're aware of the resources that SPARC can provide you and your organization, fantastic. If you're not aware of those resources, please visit our website at stalkingawareness.org. On the website, we provide practitioner guides. So those are guides for prosecutors, for advocates. There's guides for law enforcement and for court personnel, pretty much anybody that's working on stalking cases. And those there's also training modules that can assist you in your efforts to promote awareness regarding stalking, and as well as access to some past training. So this particular training will be recorded, and it will be available on our website under our training archives in the next approximately 7 to 10 days. You can also find the PDF of today's slides underneath your screen where you see the PowerPoint under materials. The PDF is provided there for you, so go ahead and download that while you have the opportunity today. And then if you are in need of a training certificate to show that you participated in today's training, please email SPARC directly, not the TA to the TA folks, and we can get that certificate to you as soon as possible. So we're going to start our time today talking a little bit about what exactly stalking is and understanding some of those behaviors and how they present in the cases that we're working on. And then we're going to spend more time understanding how does stalking intersect with domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So one of the things that we really want to concentrate on is understanding what exactly is stalking. And we use a couple of different definitions. First, there's the legal and statutory definition. So no matter what state you're joining us from today, there are laws on your books regarding stalking. Unfortunately, each of them are different. Every state has a different statute when it comes to stalking, but they all contain components that you will recognize as part of what we call our behavioral definition of stalking. And our behavioral definition of stalking says that stalking is that pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And because we have the wonderful Adobe platform today, we can all use the chat box to interact with each other. So I would love for you all to answer my questions in the chat box. If we're talking about a pattern of behavior, how many specific incidents do we need to occur to establish a pattern of behavior? Is that 1 incident, 2 incidents? I see 2 or more. Others? William, thank you for pointing out you said 2 or more in the state of New Hampshire. So one of the things that we want to be aware of is that there are a few state statutes that require 3 or more incidents, but a majority of the state statutes and what we would use as our behavioral definition, we would say it's 2 or more incidents. But one of the things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to stalking is that stalkers are extremely creative and they vary their behavior a lot. So what we might have is 1 incident of, say for instance, the offender sending the victim a text message, and another incident of the offender perhaps following the victim home or showing up at the victim's place of work or gym. Those are 2 different tactics, but together they make a pattern. So we're looking at the overall contact as far as establishing a pattern. So keep in mind that oftentimes we don't need just 2 text messages or 2 of the same incidents, the offender following the victim. It can be different tactics, but we're looking at the overall pattern. So 2 or more incidents. And then we say stalking is directed at a specific person. But who does stalking also spill over to besides the primary victim? So if we're talking about intimate partner stalking, obviously we have the victim is typically a typical current or former intimate partner, but we know that the offender also targets other people. Who else do offenders target besides their current or former intimate partner? Children and stepchildren, that's exactly right. Thank you. Family members, yep. Victims' loved ones, friends. Vanessa, thank you for mentioning pets, absolutely. Maybe a couple of the other responses here. Coworkers, yeah, thank you for recognizing that. So what we know is that oftentimes stalking will spill over to pretty much anybody the victim has a emotional or physical bond with. So know that sometimes that stalking spills over to other people because we have prohibited the offender from having contact with the victim. So for instance, if the victim has applied for a civil protection order, if there's a criminal no contact order in place, oftentimes the offender won't just stop stalking, they make someone else their target. So someone else that the victim has an emotional tie to. And then the last part of our definition says that it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Why do we think reasonable person is included in that definition? Why doesn't it just say would cause a victim to feel fear? Any idea why we use reasonable person standard versus victim? I love how interactive you all are. This is amazing. It's always hard as a presenter when no one's interacting with you, especially on virtual platforms. So the question again, why is it not listed as a reasonable person? So some of you said perhaps there might be drug and mental health issues going on. Others have mentioned that you might have a non-cooperative victim. Betty nailed it. She said fear is relevant, and that's exactly right. What we know happens in a lot of stalking cases is that incidents that might happen might seem benign to the rest of us that are on the outside because we don't understand what they mean to the victim and to the offender. We also know that sometimes people overlook things because they don't understand them as part of stalking, and that we oftentimes have victims who might articulate other emotions, things like frustration and anger rather than fear. But what we know oftentimes is when we look at stalking cases, that context in those cases is extremely critical. And we can't understand the level of fear or why these particular incidents are fear-inducing unless we have the context. And especially when we're talking about intimate partner cases, understanding that context is extremely critical to our ability to understand what's happening in the situation, as well as our ability to intervene and provide safety for victims and to hold offenders accountable. So keeping in mind that that context is extremely critical, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how prevalent is stalking? Does it really happen that often? One of the questions that I get asked whenever I do training across the country is people say to me, you know, Jennifer, we see lots of victims of domestic violence, but we just don't see that many victims of stalking. Nationwide, the statistics would tell us that about 5 million women and about 2 million men experience stalking in a one-year period. And that breaks down to about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men. So if our prevalence rates are really that high, almost as high as that of domestic violence, why is it that we are not seeing the number of cases through our doors? Why do we not have that many victims reporting? Why do we not see that many cases in our court system? Why is it that we see so few stalking cases compared to domestic violence? Yeah. So Chris is saying sometimes we get them categorized as something else. Absolutely. Other people are saying they're hard to spot or hard to prove. Absolutely. The hard to prove piece can be difficult, right? So we sometimes see barriers in these particular cases in proving them in a civil court or a criminal justice court. Sometimes it gets charged as harassment other than stalking, and that's an excellent point. One of the things that we need to consider is sometimes we have prosecutors who will pursue a harassment charge, or a harassment charge seems to be more fitting when it's charged by law enforcement because of the way that our statutes are structured in our individual states. But keep in mind that one of the things that sometimes people ask is, well, then what's the difference between harassment and stalking? Statutorily, there might not be that much difference. Behaviorally, we would say the difference between harassment and stalking is fear, where harassment is usually annoying behaviors and stalking crosses the line into fear. But understanding that lots of people experience harassment and also experience fear. The other thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the dynamics of stalking is we know that women are more likely to experience stalking than men, but when we have male victims, we also, in half of the time, have male perpetrators. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that regardless of the gender of the victim, the perpetrator is often a male. We also know that 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rate of stalking, and that happens for a couple of reasons. Typically, what we think of as far as college campus makeup, sometimes people think, well, it happens more often in that age group because people are interacting on a college campus. And while we used to think that that was true, what we've actually found out is being on a college campus is actually a protective factor because there's more people to identify and intervene in these particular cases. it really boils down to the 18 to 24-year-old age group, because that's the age group that's engaging in romantic relationships, that are figuring out what dating looks like, and that are also in the process of having their brains develop. So they're trying to figure out what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior. So although we see the 18 to 24-year-old age group as probably the highest rate of stalking, obviously stalking can affect anybody regardless of age, gender, socioeconomic class, etc. The thing is, when we look at stalking, oftentimes people consider it just as an extension of domestic violence. And while it is, one of the things to keep in mind is that stalking is its own separate crime that requires its own separate safety planning and its own separate safety interventions. And so the thing that we need to keep in mind is that it's about 62% of female victims and approximately 43% of male victims that are stalked by a current or former intimate partner. But not all stalking is intimate partner related. Obviously, today's focus, we're going to focus on those intimate partner stalking cases. But keep in mind that some of those dynamics are different when we talk about non-intimate partner stalking cases. So today our focus is really going to be on those intimate partner cases. The other thing that we need to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, even though every state has a statute on stalking, and they are all different, as I mentioned, we also have the federal level of stalking, which is when someone crosses state lines or in and out of a tribal area to commit the crime of stalking. Then they can be prosecuted on the federal level for committing the crime of stalking. We also know that when it comes to identifying these behaviors, that, as you all mentioned, sometimes stalking gets overlooked or it's hard to spot. And what we know is that oftentimes when we talk about stalking, people really are focused on the surveillance behaviors, where the offender shows up somewhere, they're following a victim, and we categorize those easily as stalking behaviors. Those particular cases are the ones that people identify easily. They're the ones where we get more involved. But we know stalking involves more than just the surveillance behaviors. And so Dr. T.K. Logan and Robert Walker from the University of Kentucky came up with a framework to help us figure out how do we classify all the different behaviors that happen in stalking cases. And the framework that they came up with is called the Sly Framework, and it stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference, and intimidation. So the surveillance category are the things that most of you are going to be pretty familiar with, where the offender follows a victim, watches them, waits for them at a certain place where they know the victim's likely to show up. They might use some kind of tracking software, or they're using the community grapevine to find out information about the victim, or they're engaging in what we call proxy stalking. And proxy stalking is just a fancy term when offenders engage other people in the pursuit of the victim. So that typically is their friends, their family members, somebody else that is helping engage in the stalking behavior. So that's what we call proxy stalking. So this particular category is the stuff that most of us are really familiar with, and they kind of make up what we call the stereotypical stalking cases. If there's going to be intervention and if there's going to be an arrest in a stalking case, it's typically because these surveillance behaviors are happening. What we fail to do as a system, and what victims are not as familiar with, are the other three categories that happen in stalking cases. Things like life invasion. So that can be unwanted contact at the victim's home. It can be showing up places. It can be invading property. And we know lots of stalking crimes also involve property invasion or property crimes of some sort, as well as public humiliation. The problem is when you look at this particular slide, these things that are listed on there are not crimes. It's not a crime to show up someplace. It's not a crime to make a phone call. Property invasion, yes, that would be a crime. But for most of these things, they're not crimes in and of themselves. And that's one of the things that makes responding to stalking so difficult, is we have to look at the totality of everything that's been happening, that entire course of conduct. And so one of the things that happens oftentimes is victims don't recognize that behaviors beyond the surveillance behaviors are stalking behaviors. And in fact, what we know from research and from working with victims is if we say to them, are you a victim of stalking, many times victims will say, no. But if we say, is somebody showing up when you didn't want them to? Is somebody humiliating you in public? Is somebody harassing your friends and family? Then victims say, oh, yeah, that's happening. but they don't identify it as stalking. And oftentimes, as responders, we don't either. And so one of the things we have to be thinking about is, can we ask better questions when we're working with victims and offenders that can cover all the behaviors that happen in stalking cases, not just the surveillance ones? So if we use the Sly Framework to frame our questions that we're asking victims, and when we're investigating these particular cases, we have a better chance that we can prove that course of conduct that we need in these particular cases. So keep in mind asking questions about life invasion, etc., as well as interference. So interference often occurs when we have offenders who are sabotaging the victim's work or their finances. They might be trying to ruin their reputation, either professionally or personally. They may be interfering with custody, as happens in lots of domestic violence and stalking cases, or attacking friends and family. And then the last category will be pretty familiar to all of you when we talk about intimidation. And that's where we have offenders who are threatening victims, who might engage in what we call symbolic violence. And symbolic violence is just violence that happens when it typically means something only to the victim and the offender. So for example, I once worked with a victim who had contacted law enforcement because she had gone out to her vehicle to go to work, and inside of her vehicle was a cup of coffee. And inside and on the cup of coffee was the pet name that her offender used to call her, and the coffee was made the exact way that she likes it, and it was still warm. She contacted law enforcement, and what she reports to dispatch is that someone left a cup of coffee in my car. And you can imagine that that did not warrant an immediate response. Law enforcement was a little bit confused about why somebody was calling to report a cup of coffee in their car. But that symbol meant something to the victim. That victim had gone across the country and relocated. That meant to the victim that the offender had found her and knew where she was at, and it was a warning to her. But what is so typical in stalking cases is we only get the tip of the iceberg. We only understand what's happening right now, and we don't necessarily know everything that's happened in the past. But what we do know is when we ask victims, why didn't you mention that behavior? Why didn't you describe this particular incident to law enforcement? Or why didn't you include that incident on your civil protection order? What victims say to us is, because no one asked me. So if we're not asking the right questions, we're not going to do an adequate job when it comes to identifying the entire course of conduct that happens in these cases, as well as being able to move them forward in our criminal justice system or be able to safety plan with the victims that we're working with. So keep that in mind. So when we look at the entire Sly Framework, one of the things that you can use the Sly Framework with in your everyday work is to ask those questions to victims, to safety plan not only around what has been happening, but what might happen. Because we know offenders change their tactics frequently. During the pandemic and during the last probably 10 to 15 years, we've seen a huge increase in stalking behaviors that involve technology. So that is a complete different training. So we're not going to get time to go into all the different forms of technology, but it's very unusual nowadays that we work on a stalking case that doesn't involve some sort of technology. And so those might be things like phone technologies, where we have offenders who are spoofing the number that shows up on caller ID, where they're using stalkerware, or what people used to refer to as spyware, where they're manipulating TTY, where they're texting victims, where they might be engaging in using GPS location or computer technologies like social networking sites, etc. None of these things are surprising to all of you because these are the cases that you're seeing frequently. But what we do know is that sometimes that technology can be considered not as serious in these stalking cases. We have people who say to us all the time, judges, prosecutors, law enforcement, well, it was just a contact through social media, or it was just a contact through the phone. Keep in mind that especially contact through technology can be just as extremely frightening for a victim and fear-inducing as in-person contact. So we need to keep in mind that we respond to these cases just because they're only, and I'm using that sarcastically, contacting the victim through that technology. We know that oftentimes offenders are engaging in a lot of other activities as well. So we need to be thinking when we're intervening, especially in our intimate partner stalking cases, all the different ways that offenders are manipulating that technology. If you'd like more information about some of those forms of technology, I would encourage you to check out a couple of different websites. The first one is the Coalition Against Stalkerware. Spark and others are part of the Coalition Against Stalkerware, which is a actually global effort to try to understand and identify all the different forms of technology that are being used as part of stalkerware in these particular cases. So I'd encourage you to check out their website, which is stopstalkerware.org. They've got some excellent resources and materials that you can share with your community, as well as checking out the fabulous website by our friends at the National Network to End Domestic Violence Tech Safety Group. Their Safety Net group has a fantastic app and website on tech safety that I would highly encourage you to be able to access that information as well. So check out their information for more information on the use of technology in stalking cases. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that stalkers are extremely creative and that they will oftentimes vary their tactics based on the reaction from the victim. We know that about 78% of stalkers use more than one means of approach. So what happens often in typical cases is we might have prevented the offender, say for instance, from contacting the victim by telephone. What I hear people say to victims of stalking a lot of times is they'll say, well, if the offender's calling you or if the offender's contacting you on Instagram, just change your phone number or get off of Instagram. But let's think about that for just a second. If I'm stalking someone and that person changes their phone number or gets off that particular social media aspect, I as a stalker don't stop stalking that person. I just change my tactics. So I show up in person instead of contacting them by phone. So keep in mind that when we are looking at these particular cases, we have to not only be looking at what has happened, but what might happen, so that we can adequately safety plan with our victims and so that we can try to hold offenders accountable for their actions. So let's really delve into intimate partner stalking and how does that look different, or does it, from other stalking cases. One of the things that I have found in doing this work for the last 22 years is that when stalking happens within the context of intimate partner violence, it often gets missed. And the research backs that up as well. So what typically happens is if we have an intimate partner violence case where the offender is doing things like monitoring the victim's phone calls, showing up at the victim's work, preventing the victim from having contact with friends and family, we have all chalked that up to part of the coercive control that happens in intimate partner violence cases. And absolutely it is. What we fail to sometimes understand, however, is that those behaviors, when they're happening within the context of intimate partner violence, are also stalking behaviors. Unfortunately, a lot of people think it only becomes stalking after the victim attempts to leave the offender. So if we have the offender who's been monitoring the victim's phone calls, it's showing up where the victim's at and interfering with the victim's job, we say, oh, it's coercive control. And when the victim leaves that abusive partner or attempts to separate from that abusive partner and the offender shows up at the victim's work or monitors the victim's social media, then people say, oh, it's stalking. Well, it was stalking when it happened within the context of domestic violence. We just didn't call it that. And some of you, especially if you're well-versed in the issues of domestic violence, will say, Jennifer, what does it really matter? Why does it matter whether we call it stalking or whether we call it intimate partner violence? It matters for two reasons. Number one, stalking is a separate crime that can be charged and it can be used to hold offenders accountable. And number two, it helps us safety plan because our domestic violence offenders who are engaging in stalking behaviors are some of our most dangerous offenders. What we know from all the research is that intimate partner stalking is different, and it's different because it's more intense and it's more dangerous. What we know is that intimate partner stalking cases last about twice as long as non-intimate partner stalking cases. It typically begins when the relationship was intact. The offender was stalking the victim while they were still together within the context of intimate partner violence. And not surprisingly, when victims separate from those offenders, the intensity and the frequency of the stalking increases. We also know that intimate partner victims of domestic violence who are also being stalked by that offender have increased safety concerns and increased risk of violence from the offender. So we know that domestic violence offenders cause risks for safety for victims. We all know that when victims of domestic violence separate from their offenders, that there's an increased risk of danger. What we need to keep in mind is if that victim has been experienced stalking within the context of that domestic violence, either while it was happening or once they attempt to separate, those particular individuals are at an increased risk of safety concerns and an increased risk of violence from the offender. What we also know is that those intimate partner stalkers are much more likely to physically approach a victim. They're more interfering and insulting because they know all the information about the victim. If we're talking about stalking cases that involve weapons, typically they're intimate partner stalking cases. And those intimate partner offenders escalate much more quickly than other stalkers, and they reoffend because they feel like they have a right to ownership and interference with the victim. So if those intimate partner offenders are stalking victims, what we need to keep in mind is even, for instance, if they get a civil protection order, we all could have a couple-hour discussion on how effective civil protection orders are in domestic violence cases. One of the things that you need to keep in mind is if we have intimate partner victims who are applying for civil protection orders, if they're also experience stalking in addition to the intimate partner violence, they are 4 times more likely to be physically assaulted by the offender. They're 9.3 times more likely to experience sexual assault, and they're 4.7 times more likely to be injured by that offender. So if we have DV plus stalking, we have some of our most dangerous cases. But if we never identified that that was stalking within the context of intimate partner violence, how do we have that conversation? How do we identify that risk at an accurate level? And the answer is we don't, because we chalked it up to part of the coercive control that happens in intimate partner violence, and we didn't identify and name it as a separate issue of stalking. Many of you are doing threat assessments when it comes to stalking cases, and when it comes to domestic violence cases. And many of you are understanding that there are certain factors that happen in intimate partner violence cases that increase the risk of dangerousness or lethality for victims. One of the things you need to keep in mind is when you're doing threat assessment, stalking is one of those risk factors. In 85% of attempted and 76% of completed intimate partner femicides, so intimate partner femicide is when you have a female victim that was murdered by an intimate partner, there has been an episode of stalking that happened in the year prior to the attack. 85% of attempted. That's a huge number. And we know that as far as lethality risk in intimate partner homicides, that stalking produces a 3-fold increase in the risk of intimate partner homicide. When you look at this list, though, and this was a fantastic meta-analysis of 17 intimate partner homicide studies, if you look at these risk factors, and you'll see them listed here, numbers 1 through 10. And for those of you that are just calling, apologize for that. There are 10 factors listed, including things like controlling behavior and threatening to call the victim. If you're looking at this particular slide, what other behaviors besides number 8 that's highlighted, what other behaviors on here might also be stalking behaviors? Number 1, what guesses would you have? Number 3, non-fatal strangulation could be one, yes. Yes, number 5, controlling behaviors. We just talked about all the different Sly strategies that happen in stalking cases. Number 5 of controlling behaviors or threats to harm the victim. Number 6, absolutely are often stalking behaviors. As could number 9, jealous behavior, etc. Yeah, so one of the things that I would like you, if you don't change anything that you do with victims of domestic violence, please start considering what behaviors that are occurring in those particular cases that could also be stalking behaviors. Because if we identify those and we name them and we give victims the language that might be helpful in their reporting processes, or more importantly in their safety planning processes, we're doing a great service to victims. We're helping them identify what particular incidents might be extremely dangerous for them, as well as understanding the risks that this particular case might pose. So one of the things to keep in mind as we look at these, though, is that oftentimes we have developed tools, so domestic violence risk assessment tools. So some of you might be using things like the danger assessment or the lethality assessment by Jacqueline Campbell. Some of you are using the lethality assessment protocol, otherwise known as the LAP, to identify danger in domestic violence cases. And that's excellent. Please continue to do so. One of the things we need to keep in mind, though, is that victims' perception of risk is often better than any risk management tool that's out there. So yes, those tools are fantastic at being able to produce a pretty accurate picture of risk, but we also can't ignore our victim's own perceptions. If you're working with a victim and they say, I think this person is going to harm me, or I think this person's going to kill me, we have to also then put credibility in our victim's own perceptions. What we also see happen in these particular cases is that when stalking is happening within the context of intimate partner violence, we've all kind of agreed that we chalk it up to things like jealousy or coercive control, and we don't name it as stalking. And so sometimes when we do risk assessments on domestic violence, we don't accurately understand all the different types of stalking risks that happen in these cases. There is a risk assessment particularly for stalking victims, and one of the things that most people aren't aware of is that A, it even exists, or B, how to access it. So the stalking risk assessment was actually developed by Dr. T.K. Logan, the same person that developed the Sly strategies, and you can find it at coercivecontrol.org. So this particular assessment is called SHARP, and it stands for the Stalking, Harassment, Assessment, and Risk Profile, and it's available at coercivecontrol.org. And the thing that I really like about SHARP is it gives us not only a narrative report and the actual risk profile, but it also gives us a safety plan that's tailored to this particular case. So it's free of charge, does not cost any money. You're more than welcome to get on coercivecontrol.org and walk through the assessment to see all the different options that are available there and the questions that it asks you. The thing that I find super helpful in these particular intimate partner stalking cases is I might use a domestic violence assessment like the lethality assessment plan or the danger assessment by Dr. Campbell to identify that some of the behaviors that are happening might be stalking behaviors, and then to use this particular assessment to go one step further. So for instance, if I have a victim who's answering, or we've answered yes on the lethality assessment protocol about the offender being jealous and interfering, that might then trigger me to say, okay, now I'm going to use a stalking risk assessment to be able to delve further into the behaviors that are happening in these particular cases. So it's an excellent tool to be able to use to really delve into all the different risk factors that happen in stalking cases, and it analyzes 14 different risk factors. So it looks at the big picture of the stalking case. So things like what's the course of conduct, which is the Sly behaviors that I mentioned earlier. Has there been an escalation in the behaviors? What are the nature and context of the threats? What we know is the more specific the threat, the higher increased risk of danger to a victim. And then it also examines the stalker mindset. So what's the stalker's motive? Has there been proxy stalking happening? Are there weapons involved? Has there been a disengagement by the victim who's saying, I don't want to have any contact with the offender anymore, and the offender has persisted in contacting the victim? It also looks at the stalker's history, so their control and jealousy history, if they've been violent with other people, what their criminal justice history has been, or if there has been substance use or mental health issues. And last but not least, it looks at the fear level that happens in these particular cases. What's the level of fear from the victim? How savvy are stalkers when it comes to the use of technology? And how vulnerable are our victims? So I'm seeing some of you are saying no audio. Are other people still able to hear me again? Yeah, okay. Thanks all. You get a little bit paranoid after it happens one time. So how many of you, I would love to hear from some of you. I saw a couple of people type in the chat that you have used the SHARP assessment before. Others, is this new information to you? Is it something that you can see yourself using in domestic violence cases? Okay, a couple of you are saying it's new information, and that's not unusual. Don't feel bad. This assessment's only been out for about 3 years, so lots of people are not familiar with it. So keep in mind that one of the things that can be super helpful is to get on the assessment and use it a couple of times before you sit down to work on it with a victim. You can get on there and do like a test case, and you can have a victim present with you when you fill out. You don't need a victim present with you. It asks enough questions that if you don't have all the information about this particular case, it will still give you a very accurate predictor of the level of risk. So some folks are using this to increase their ability to safety plan with victims. Some jurisdictions are using it to gather background information about the case and be able to put a better police report in front of their prosecutor. So think about the ways that you can use it in these particular cases. And it's kind of a best kept secret. I think all of you, once you have a chance to be able to use it, will find that it's extremely helpful. If you have additional questions about the risk assessment, Spark has an entire webinar on the risk assessment that's on our website. So if you go to stalkingawareness.org and look under our training archives, you'll see a webinar that we did previously a few months ago that was recorded that goes more in-depth into the risk assessment. So please just access our website and view that risk assessment webinar if you'd like more information. I also see several of you still asking for the PDF of the slides of this document. If you're logging in by phone, obviously you can't see that. If you're on the webinar with me, it's under the materials box right underneath your slides where it says Stalking and IPV, and you can click on it and download the PDF of the slides. So go ahead and do that. If you aren't able to get them, we'll certainly make sure that you can get a PDF after this particular webinar. So let's understand a little bit about the impact that stalking is having on our intimate partner victims. And obviously, we know the impact is great. We see mental health concerns for victims who are saying things like, I feel like I'm going crazy, I feel like I'm losing my mind. One of the things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to stalking cases, especially intimate partner stalking cases, is that our offenders are very good at gaslighting victims, making victims feel like they're making everything up and blowing things out of proportion. And one thing that we know is that when victims of stalking often reach out for help from those of us that are responders, they have become so hypervigilant about the stalking that's happening in their life that they equate everything with the stalking. And so they've become so hypervigilant, constantly looking over their shoulder, never knowing what's going to happen next, that when they talk to responders or they talk to their friends or their family about what's been happening, sometimes people say, I think the victim's a little paranoid. They're not paranoid. They're hypervigilant. And that hypervigilance has kept them safe in these particular situations. So we have to keep in mind that when we look at stalking cases, they cause an immense amount of trauma to victims. But what happens in many cases is because there's no physical violence that has happened, as responders, we have a tendency to overlook the importance of these particular cases, as well as overlook the consequences that it's having on the victims that we're working with. And so oftentimes we see a different level of urgency from responders like law enforcement or even advocates and mental health providers when it comes to domestic violence. And we don't see that same level of urgency when it comes to stalking cases. But with everything that we just went through about the risk that intimate partner stalking cases cause, I think it's fair to say that we also need to consider all the impacts that stalking has on the victims that we're working with as well. The problem is many times victims of stalking don't know that they can access services, or if they do report, they don't necessarily get an adequate response because of all the reasons that we talked about earlier, how stalking can be overlooked, how it's thought of as a minor thing. So keep in mind that when we consider the impact on victims, the impact is great, and we have to keep in mind that many victims are experiencing trauma not only from the offender, but from our lack of response as a system. We also know that when we look at these particular cases, if we have domestic violence plus stalking, we have an increased rate of the harm that's happening to victims. This particular study gives you a little bit of an insight. So let me try to explain the slide to you, and especially for those of you who are on the phone. So this study looked at victims of domestic violence who had experienced a violation of protection order as well as victims of domestic violence who had experienced a violation of protection order and stalking behaviors, okay? So we have a set of victims who had no violations, a set of victims who had a violation and it was an intimate partner violation, and then we had a set of victims who had experienced not only the violation but also stalking behaviors. And this slide shows us that those victims who had experienced the violation plus the stalking behaviors experienced a much higher level of threats and harassment. They experienced a higher level of physical injury. They experienced a higher level of control, of financial harm, of child interference, as well as a higher level of the offender hurting other people besides the victim. In a lot of cases, sometimes, as far as like hurting others or threats and harassment, the level of harm was twice as high if they were also experiencing stalking. And intuitively, this makes sense to all of us who are working on domestic violence cases, because we know that when we have a victim who's separated or has a civil protection order in place, that the level of harm often increases. But what we need to keep in mind is if you have that civil protection order and a victim who's experiencing those stalking behaviors, they're experiencing an immense amount of harm, and their risk is through the roof. So we have to be able to identify those stalking behaviors separate from the violations of civil protection order. And I saw a couple of you earlier write, well, then what's the difference between a violation of protection order and stalking crime? Oftentimes they coincide. We can have offenders who are charged with violations of civil protection order as well as stalking. They can be two separate charges. Now, there are a couple of states that prohibit that charge from happening, but in most states, you can charge both a violation of civil protection order and a stalking crime. It's another tool to be able to hold our offenders accountable, and it helps us as responders recognize, yes, we have violation of protection orders, and we have stalking occurring in these particular cases as well. We can enhance our ability to be able to safety plan with our victims when we identify that. And some of you are, thanks William, some of you are pointing out that obtaining a civil protection order might be the first step in establishing our course of conduct. In a lot of states, when you have victims who obtain a civil order of protection, if we have an offender who violates that civil order of protection in the process of stalking the victim, we might also have an enhanced charge. So it might be aggravated stalking, it might rise from a misdemeanor to a felony if there's also a civil protection order or a criminal no contact order in place when the offender is engaging in that stalking behavior. Questions over the materials that I've presented so far before we talk a little bit about the impact on children? What we also know is obviously we see children used as tools in domestic violence cases where offenders are manipulating the children as part of the contact and part of the manipulation that happens in domestic violence cases. What we also know is that partner stalking victims who have a child in common with the offender are 8.4 times more likely to experience threats against the child or experience interference in their custody after a CPO has been entered. So 8.4 times more likely than DV victims. And we all know how prevalent that happens in DV victims. So think about it, if you have a domestic violence victim who's also experiencing stalking, and we have an 8 times more likelihood that they're also going to experience interference with the children, incredibly concerning. And we know, obviously, that those children are often used as a tool to harass and to stalk our victims. So then let's talk a little bit about the safety planning. How do we, if we identify now that stalking is happening within the context of domestic violence, how do we safety plan around that? I also see a few of you asking about a hard copy of the web. So I'm assuming, Constance, that you're referring to a hard copy of the questions that are asked on the SHARP assessment. And there isn't a hard copy that you can download on the website, but at Spark we have already anticipated and heard that question. So we have written down all the questions on a Word document. So if you would like access to that, please just send me an email and I'm happy to send you the hard copy that you can use. I see others of you asking, well, how do we screen for stalking when these particular cases come through our doors? So for instance, if victims are accessing services from our domestic violence and sexual assault program, if they're coming in, contacting law enforcement, how do we screen for stalking? So the things that we would ask and consider are to ask questions about Is somebody monitoring you? Is somebody threatening you? And I have a list of questions that I'm more than happy to send you if that's something that you would like to incorporate in your in your screening process in working with domestic violence victims. So please just send me an email. And I see Brianne has put my the email for Spark on the website here. It's info@stalkingawareness.org, or my direct email is director@stalkingawareness.org, and it'll be on the last slide when we get to it here in a few minutes. So if you would like those copies, please reach out to us. Please also keep in mind there's about 200 of you on this webinar. Spark has a full-time staff of 2 people. So please be generous in your patience with us when you reach out to us. We will try to get those to you as soon as possible, but know that it could take just a few minutes. Also keep in mind, if you're typing in here and giving me your address, that's helpful, but I'm not going to get that for the next 10 days when I get the recording back. So if you can email me before that, I'm more than happy to respond to you. Otherwise, I'll be looking through the chat as well. So when we look at this safety piece of things, one of the things that I think we have done a poor job as a system when it comes to responding to stalking is we've all done a really great job about being able to understand and describe the dynamics that happen in domestic violence cases. And we're all very adept at being able to explain why victims continue to have contact with offenders. And we haven't necessarily applied that same skill set when we talk about stalking cases. One of the things that we know is if victims are able to completely disengage with the offender, that's ideal. Not having any contact, being able to say to the offender, I don't want to have contact with you, and then going forward, we know that all that contact is unwanted. We also know that any type of engagement with the offender can be problematic. If the offender calls the victim 34 times, and on the 35th question, the victim calls, and she picks up and says, the offender, pound sand, leave me alone, the offender is going to call back 35 times the next time they call. So any type of engagement isn't ideal because it just reinforces the offender's behavior. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is in our conversation with intimate partner stalking victims to say to them, it's ideal if you don't have any contact with the offender. Even negative contact reinforces their behavior. But we understand that many stalking victims are having contact with the offender because they're trying to negotiate for their safety. They're trying to minimize the threat. You know that old adage, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer? That's what victims of stalking are often doing. They're doing a temperature check. They're having contact with the offender because it's a safety strategy. So keep in mind that oftentimes we have victims of intimate partner stalking who are engaging with the offender, number one, because we've court-ordered it because they share custody with a minor child, or number two, they're doing it because they're safety planning. So just because we have a victim who's making contact with their intimate partner stalking offender doesn't mean we don't have a stalking case, okay? You can still show that the victim feels fear and that they might actually be engaging with the offender because they're scared. So please don't let that engagement feel like a barrier when it comes to stalking cases. We've gotten really good at explaining those things in domestic violence cases. We need to be able to explain them in stalking cases as well, okay? I saw some of you said earlier, you know what, I have victims that I work with keep a log of the stalking incidents, and that's an excellent suggestion. Sometimes what I see is people saying, I tell victims to keep a journal, and that's not necessarily helpful because what we know is then victims aren't provided any guidance about what they're supposed to be writing in the journal or how to have contact or not have contact or what exactly is evidence and what isn't evidence. It would be better, actually, if victims use a stalking log. So stalking logs include things like the date and time and the description of the incident, the location of the incident, and if there's any witness names and if the police were called. Why do you think on the log we have location listed? Why would we list? Jurisdiction. Excellent, Alyssa. Yep, and a bunch of you popping in saying the same thing. Yeah. We know that oftentimes stalking spills over in jurisdictions. And so we might have a victim who works one place and goes to school in a different place and whose mom lives in a different jurisdiction. And what victims believe is that once they report the incident to one particular police officer, that all the police officers in their area have access to that information. And we all know that that's not accurate. Sometimes we have shifts that don't know what the other shift is doing. Writing down the location can help us establish jurisdiction. And one of the questions we get at Spark frequently is, well, who has jurisdiction in a stalking case? And my kind of tongue-in-cheek response is whoever is willing to take it. Where victims live, where the crime has occurred, where the offenders might live, all of those things can be used to establish jurisdiction. What happens in some stalking cases is people pass it off to somebody else. And they say, well, the victim doesn't live here, so I can't really move this case forward. We used to do the same thing when it comes to domestic violence cases, and then we stopped because victims were being harmed because of our inadequate response. Keep in mind, any place there was an element that occurred, as William points out in New Hampshire, that's pretty much it in every jurisdiction. Any place that an element of the crime occurred can establish jurisdiction. So I see a couple of you asking, how do we then access this log? This is available on the Spark website. So if you go to our website and you look under pretty much any link on there, so victim resources, victim service provider resources, the documentation log is on there. And it's available in both English as well as Spanish. One side has the log itself. The other side has instructions to victims on how to use the log. So please get on there, download it, use it in the work that you're doing, share it. I don't care if you put your logo on it, whatever you do, but use it as a form of being able to identify and respond to these particular cases. The other thing that we need to consider when we talk about safety in these particular cases is that we have to constantly be evolving our safety plans. We already talked about how creative offenders are and how they change their tactics frequently. We have to keep in mind not only safety planning about what's been happening, but what might occur. So using those SLY strategies as ways to talk about behaviors that might happen next, and being able to have conversations with victims about if you, say for instance, don't go to the gym that you typically work at anymore and you don't show up there anymore, what do you think the stalker's reaction might be? And how do we anticipate that, and what might their next tactic be? The other thing that we need to consider is in a lot of stalking crimes, people really want to focus on victims stopping certain behaviors. We don't want to do that, okay? We have to be able to have the very real conversation about being able to balance safety and freedom. Victims shouldn't have to stop going places, shouldn't have to get off social media, shouldn't have to change their phone numbers because of the offender's behavior. We should be holding offenders accountable for that, not asking victims to make adjustments. And that's a conversation that's really difficult with victims because many victims will say, I feel like I don't have any freedom anymore. And so being able to have that very real conversation about balancing safety with freedom. Victims should be able to do whatever they normally do in their life. We should be able to hold offenders accountable for it. So some of the resources I want to highlight for all of you, and our hour together always goes by so quickly. Some of the things I want to point out to a couple of you that can be particularly helpful that you've asked questions about in the chat. So number one is a simple brochure on stalking that you can have available in your agency as law enforcement in packets of information that you give out to victims, available on your website. This particular brochure is available in English and Spanish, and it's basically Stalking 101. On the back of it is room for you to write the contact number for your local victim service providers. So you can put that on the back. You can download these particular brochures directly from our website. We can also mail them out, but our office has been closed indefinitely right now to the pandemic, so we don't have access to do that. But you can certainly download them off of our website. They're in full color or they're in different formats, so you can just download them, print them out, and give them to the victims that you're working with. The other thing that might be helpful for you is if we have prosecutors on the phone, there's a prosecutor's guide to prosecuting stalking on our website. There's a guide for folks who are working in probation and parole, something we didn't get a chance to talk to today, but one of the things we need to consider is how do we continue to monitor stalking offenders, okay? So accessing that information, as well as there's a guide for advocates on our website. So how do you advocate for victims of stalking? There's also a guide that I would encourage you all to think about as far as a checklist about how often you're working with victims of stalking. There's a safety planning guide on our website as well as understanding if you are a domestic violence and sexual assault agency, and many of you I can see are, how well are you letting victims know that the resources that you provide to victims in your county include resource for victims of stalking. This stalking checklist will allow you to go through your particular agency, and it'll ask you questions like, how often do you talk about stalking on your website? Do you have any stalking brochures? Do you celebrate Stalking Awareness Month in the month of January? Do you, during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, talk about the connection between domestic violence and stalking? And guess what? You don't have to do a heavy lift on this. If you're thinking, how do I let the community know that we do all this stuff? The resources are right on our website. We'll show you how to do that. We have social media posts that you can share that help people make the connection. We know that there's not a single one of you on here who's underworked and overpaid. So just use the resources that we have available on our website. Everything that we do is free, and it's all downloadable. And the website, again, is above where Brianna put it in there, and it's stalkingawareness.org. And here it is again for all of you. And follow us on social media. Our handle is Follow Us Legally on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. You can repost our posts as far as the connection between domestic violence and stalking this month, and then watch out for all of the information that we'll have available for January for Stalking Awareness Month. And then this is my direct email. So I saw lots of you still posting your addresses in the chat. That's great. A faster way to get the information that you need from me is to just send me an email, because it will take me, like I said earlier, about 10 days to get the recording from this particular webinar. So if you want the Spark, if you want those resources that we talked about as far as SHARP goes, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint and you weren't able to download it today, you can certainly just send me an email. Keep in mind, again, if you are able to find it under here where it says Materials and Stalking and IPV, you can click on that, and that will give you a PDF of the PowerPoint that we went over today. The other thing that I would encourage you to think about is some of this information is also available in the training modules on our website. You can go to training modules and click on it, and if you're doing community education awareness in your community, you can click on it and it gives you the PowerPoint, the handout, and all these activities, et cetera, that you can use in your own efforts to raise awareness and give presentations on stalking. So just go ahead and do that. No more worries. I have a whopping like 20 seconds for questions right now, probably because I had to log off and log back in with my telephone. But if you have additional questions, please put them in the chat. I will stay on for a few minutes to answer those questions. Otherwise, what I would say to all of you is thank you from the bottom of my heart for, number one, giving up an hour of your time today to listen to this webinar, and number two, for the work that you are doing every single day on behalf of stalking victims. We so appreciate the work that you do, and we appreciate the efforts that you're making. I saw somebody answer questions about CEUs. Send those questions to me, Hannah. Please do not email the TA to TA folks. They're going to just send you to me. So send me an email if you need a certificate that you attended the webinar, but keep in mind that it might take a little bit for me to get that to you. So Vanessa's asking, would it be better to eliminate a stalker's ability to watch their victim via stalkerware or give a victim the ability to choose what information gets sent to the stalker? Great question, Vanessa. We know oftentimes if victims try to remove stalkerware or something off of their phone, that just escalates the violence for the offender. So one strategy might be to have a conversation with the victims about how to use their phone in a safer manner and considering what they use their phone for. The other thing might be to consider getting a different phone that they use that's a safer phone while they keep the old phone and let the offender access it, because that information is giving us evidence that we might use in prosecuting the offender. So it could be a strategy that the victim takes the phone that the offender has access to, puts it in a desk drawer, doesn't use it, allows for evidence to gather, and then we turn that over to law enforcement and prosecutors. Obviously, if we put it in a desk drawer, then we're not subjecting victims to additional emotional harm. Other victims might say, no, I want to completely get rid of this phone, or I want to try to remove the stalkerware. Keep in mind that removing the stalkerware is extremely difficult, and there are those safety concerns that doing so might actually increase the level of violence. So keep that in mind if that's an option, and I'm happy to talk over individual cases with you if you want to call me or send me an email. All right, I don't see any other questions that are coming up as of now, but I'm going to continue to stay on for a few more minutes. Otherwise, thank you again, all of you, for spending your time with us this afternoon. And for the work that you do every single day. Happy Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and remember that January is Stalking Awareness Month. The question was, are we having another webinar soon? Javier, if you want to sign up for our newsletter or check our website, we announce the webinars that we're doing on an ongoing basis. So you can look for those on that particular calendar, or if you have access to the TA calendar, that will list them for you as well. But just check out upcoming trainings on our website, and we host webinars quarterly, so there'll be additional ones coming up the rest of the year. So thank you all so much. I appreciate your time today.